I want to start with two assertions slash observations. Observation slash assertion one, it's not going particularly well. I think that starting from Professor Kropp's talk and several of my predecessors, I think that's a fair thing to say. If at least we judge progress by an actual, or this progress rather, by an actual increase in emissions, that is to say, an increase in the flux of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. The second observation is perhaps more of a question, which is, at what point are we guilty of naivety when we think that top-down legislation is going to get us anywhere? In my considered opinion, there hasn't been any real progress on the top-down sort of front since 1987, Montreal Protocol. A protocol that wasn't, I remind you, even about CO2. So at what point are we guilty of naivety? So through a process of elimination, I would almost say, are locally led solutions, the sort of answer, well, it's like, well, yes, what else would be the answer? Nothing. Okay, and a few sort of random left field thoughts and observations, mostly perhaps to help make sure that we are not just sort of making assumptions in the discussion ahead. So just some random observations from my experience. The first one is a lack of good science is not the problem. It is not a lack of information that is holding things up. The second one is that dysfunctional policy can actually enable local innovations and solutions. I'll give quickly the example of Laos. No one knew about the small-scale hydro solutions from rewired Chinese car engines that were providing micro-hydro solutions to villages. Not the World Bank, not the local government, not the IPCC. It completely sprung up more or less out of nowhere. And perhaps the UK also, with until quite recently not much by the way of top-down community renewables policy. It's a Darwinian landscape of business models, which I think wouldn't have arisen without a lack of policy. So my point there, sometimes dysfunctional policy can enable local innovation or a lack of policy. The second observation is ambitious climate policy can be a hindrance. Let's take Scotland. World famous decarbonisation and emissions reductions targets for 2020. One of the results I would assert is that there's been very little thought given to quote unquote grassroots innovations because they're too slow and risky from a policy perspective. From the perspective of a government that is bought into ambitious targets. So we might be shooting ourselves in the foot. Observation 4, top-down policy can also play a crucial role. One quick example, South Africa has a mandatory buy-in for anyone developing renewables. They have to give local equity to local stakeholders, and I've seen amazing examples of how that gets used for local training and so on. So that is an example of policy actually working. Observation 5, one of the major threats, I think, from an academic point of view is the temptation of measurability. It's very easy to start measuring things, and also policymakers like that, but there's an opportunity cost to non-working climate policy. I'm increasingly concerned about the sort of tension between climate policy on the one hand and what I might call old-school conservation efforts. One quick example on that, wood biomass, where we now see plantations being completely geared towards fast-track monoculture carbon per unit area style approaches and outputs in order to cater for the wood biomass industry, which in turn is driven by measurable targets and so on, at the cost of old-fashioned ecosystem services. And lastly, transition is a very tempting term. It sounds sort of very, managed and technocratic, but I would suggest that disruptive change is going to be inevitable, either driven by the force of necessity or something else. Thank you.